Okay, so that was my study of Sudbury Valley. So I want now to move on to what exactly is play and why is it such a powerful vehicle for learning. So now I really want to, I've been sort of talking about the evidence that children educate themselves very well through play when they have the opportunity to do so, but now I really want to talk about what is play. So play is a concept that the more we think about it, the more confusing it is in a way as a concept. There are a lot of paradoxes about play. Play is serious, and yet it is not serious. Play is imaginative and spontaneous, and yet I'm going to argue that play is always bound by rules, and in fact it's how children learn to follow rules. Play is not real. It takes place in the fantasy world, in the imaginary world, and yet I will argue it is always about the real world, and it is how children learn to cope with and adapt to the real world. Play is childish, and yet almost every cultural historian has argued that it underlies the greatest cultural achievements of adults. Almost all adults who've contributed in some novel and interesting and creative way to the culture says that for them this is play. So these are the contradictions about play. From a biological perspective, as I've argued, play is nature's way of ensuring that young mammals will practice the kinds of skills they need to practice to be successful in the culture and or the environment in which they are growing. From a religious point of view, we might say that play is God's gift which makes life worthwhile on earth. Imagine life without play. If you imagine life without play, you are largely imagining the lives of many, many children in our culture today, because we have more or less taken play from children. We've substituted school, we've substituted adult-directed activities, we've substituted all kinds of pressures for play. And then we wonder why the suicide rate keeps rising for school-age children, why the rate of anxiety and depression is higher than it's ever been before. Anxiety and depression don't exist in hunter-gatherer cultures, every anthropologist tells me. But we see it all the time in our cultures today. I believe it's school that's creating that. I believe it's our adult surveillance of children, our constant adult guidance, our taking away of freedom from children that is doing all of that. So that's what play, that's one way of looking at what play is. On the handout, I've listed some universal varieties of play. Let me just list them quickly, and what I want to point out is that these universal varieties of play represent the universal skills that children everywhere need to develop in any culture to be successful in that culture. Physical, locomotor play, chasing, wrestling, climbing trees, running around. These are how young mammals of every species develop their physical bodies. We, like all other mammals, have physical bodies. This is how animals develop good hearts and lungs, good, strong muscles. It's also how they develop courage, because in many other mammals as well as our young children play in risky ways when we allow them to do it. They climb trees too high. If we're talking about kids today, they skateboard down banisters. They dive off of cliffs. They do all of these things that we should not watch them do. We should turn away. We should not be there. Because if we're there, we're inclined to stop them or tell them to be careful. But when we stop them from doing this, we're preventing them from exerting their natural way of developing courage. Children are much better than we are at judging whether those children themselves can do what they're doing. They're not. We would not have survived as a species if they did risky things that really would kill themselves at a fairly high rate of frequency. Not to say that it doesn't happen. It happens with other species too. Every once in a long, long time, an animal or a child will die because of the risky play that they engaged in. But when we deprive them of risky play, we're depriving them of the opportunity to learn how to deal with risk, to learn how to deal with fear. That little girl who climbs a tree way up higher than her mom would want her to climb it, she is climbing to the point where she feels some fear. And then at some point it verges on terror, and then she comes down. She's not going to go so high that she can't deal with it. She goes as high as she can deal with it, and then she comes down. And then the glow on that child's face. I did that. I climbed that high in that tree. I felt fear, but I survived it. That little girl is much less likely, as her life goes on, to have a panic attack or to fall apart when a real emergency occurs. And this is why all mammals play in risky ways, so that they can develop the kind of courage that prevents them from falling apart. One of the reasons so many of our young people are falling apart at record levels compared to any time in the past is because we, more than any time in the past, are preventing them from playing in risky ways. So that's physical play. Children play with language. We are the species that talks. Children learn language through play. The first cooing and babbling is always playful. The first words are always used in play. They're never used really to ask for anything. The child is just playing with words. And as children get older, they play in more and more complex ways with language. There's actual research studies that show that children, when they're playing with one another, use much more complex language than they do ever when they're talking with adults, and way more complex language when they're talking with teachers in school. So language is developed in play. It's not taught to children. We are the animal with opposable thumbs that survives by building things. If we're hunter-gatherers, we build huts, we build tools, we build shelters, we build means of conveyance. All people in all cultures build things. So it's not surprising that children all over the world play at building things. They play at using those opposable thumbs, using the parts of the brain that design something and then act out on that design through the hands to create something. We play everywhere in imaginary ways. In fact, I'm going to argue that all play involves at least some degree of imagination, but some play kinds of more so than others. When children are playing fantasy games, pretending that this is so, they're exercising what is really the highest aspect of human thinking, which is hypothetical thinking. Hypothetical thinking is always imaginary thinking about things that aren't actually present. This is what differentiates our way of thinking from that of any other animal. As far as we know, other animals are not capable of imagination. But we are, and that's why we can think about tomorrow, and we can think about things that don't really exist, and why we can invent things and develop scientific hypotheses to explain things and so on. And children are practicing that all the time in their imaginary play. We play games with all. I'm going to argue that all play involves rules, but some play involves very formal, specified, explicit rules. People in all culture have to follow rules. And so it's no surprise that children come into the world designed to play games with explicit rules, where in order to play this game, you've got to do things in a certain kind of relatively prescribed way. There's always room for creativity within the rules, but you can't go out of the bounds of the rules in the play. And most of all is social play. All these children all over the world mostly play with other children. Solitary play is fairly unique to Western cultures because we isolate children from one another in ways that children have never throughout the history of human beings prior to modern times been isolated from one another. And so children are designed to play socially no matter what other way they're playing. And why would that be? Because the most important thing that human beings have to learn is how to get along with other human beings. You can live a happy life without knowing how to read or write or build a dugout canoe or even hunt if you're in a hunter-gatherer culture, but you cannot live a happy life if you don't know how to get along with other human beings. We absolutely depend upon other human beings, and children are practicing all the time in how to get along with other human beings, how to negotiate differences if you're playing a game together, how to pay attention to whether your playmate is happy or not, because if your playmate is not happy, he or she's going to quit and you're going to be left alone. These are the really important lessons of life, and there's no way to teach them. The only way that these things are learned are through experience, and for children that experience is in play. So no surprise that children are driven to play with other children. Playing with adults doesn't do it, and I'll explain why it doesn't do it. Too much of an authority difference, too much of an energy difference, too much of a difference in sense of humor, so on and so forth between the child and the adult. I have a colleague who's an anthropologist who studies children throughout the world, and he says that the idea that adults should play with children is a uniquely Western idea. You would be laughed at in most traditional cultures if you